So once the boil is completed, we bring the temperature down to room temperature. This allows an optimum environment for yeast to be introduced to the brew.
Now the yeast cells are going to come in, and what are they looking for? They're looking for the sugars you produce in the brew house. So those yeast cells are going to come in and consume all the available sugar. Their byproduct is CO2 and alcohol. As the fermentation process happens, so in the brew house it only takes 6 hours to produce the wort. Once it's in the fermenter, you're going to have a 3 to 5 day fermentation period where the sugars are being consumed by the yeast, your alcohol is being produced, and CO2. As the yeast cells run out of food, you will stop that fermentation process by cooling down the tank. As you cool down the tank, they're coned on the bottom. All the yeast collects in that cone down there, and that's harvestable yeast. So then you use that yeast for your next batch of beer that's going to be coming out later down the road. And you can use this yeast up to 15 to 20 generations before it's non-viable anymore. And when we talk about viability of yeast, you have yeast cells that have intact cell walls. What we do is we take them into the lab. The dead cells do not have intact cell walls, so their cell wall is ruptured. We dilute it down. You add a little bit of methylene blue dye to it. The dead cells will absorb that dye. The live cells will reject it. Then you look at it underneath the microscope, and you count your live yeast and you count your dead yeast, and that's your viability. So we don't go below 75% viability with our yeast. Once we see that viability drop, then it's time to get rid of that yeast and start a new culture.
Yeast is probably the most misunderstood ingredient in beer as far as the amount of flavor and aroma and complexity it gives to a beer. A lot of fruity flavors, clovey, spicy flavors, they actually come from yeast itself. And so if something tastes very fruity, it doesn't mean the brewers put fruit in the beer. It could be that yeast strain itself. When yeast eats sugar, it puts out alcohol and CO2 gas and about 200 other byproducts. And these can be good tasting or bad tasting depending on how we manipulate those. And so we watch the temperature, the pH, the mineral content, and the food source that the yeast is an environment.
Another thing is one of the biggest differences between what we do here in a big brewery and what you're doing at home mostly has to do with temperature control. Yeast is very sensitive to changes in temperature, and it's really startling how different a beer can be produced by just changing that fermentation for a couple of degrees. So finding a spot in your house for fermentation is going to be a good and important thing for you to do. You want to find a spot that's going to have a nice, consistent temperature. If you're shooting to be brewing ales, you want that temperature to be kind of in the mid to high 60s, low 70s. If you're doing lagers, you want it to be in about the mid 50s. Sometimes that's not always practical, but you can use the natural seasons to also help with this temperature control. A lot of times in your garage, in the summertime, you might be able to keep it around 65, and in the winter or fall would be a good time for you doing your lagers in the garage there.